The first step when we want to create a terrain is to generate the mesh of the terrain, and the mesh is the shape or the form of the terrain onto which everything else will be put. So I don't need any animation stuff, so I hide this, and I want to see the SceneTerrain options. So I go to the scene settings, and near the bottom you should see the SceneTerrain options panel. At the top of this panel you have a few general options, and then you have 4 tabs. And the one that is that we want now is the preset shape tab. If we leave everything on the default values, we can just click on the Generate Terrain button, and after a very short while we have a terrain. Good. We can click on the Generate Terrain several times, and we have different terrains each time. That's as easy. Now we probably want something more specific, so we have to understand what the options do. But first, the terrain, how is it made? It's very simple. There are 2 objects. The green object is the terrain, the actual terrain shape. It's the terrain mesh. It's called SceneTerrain, and the blue object is the water volume object, and it's called SceneTerrain water volume. It's this object is a child of the SceneTerrain object. So if you want to move the terrain in your scene, you should move the SceneTerrain object. Okay, and also each of them is a regular. It has been generated, but it's a regular mesh. You can just edit them as you would with any other mesh. Just remember that the next time you generate the terrain, your manual changes will be lost, because everything will be regenerated. So if you want to keep the terrain, you can, a terrain that you edit manually, and you want to generate a new one on the side, you have to change the name of the mesh and the object to anything other than their default values. Okay. Now let's see those values here, the general values, what they do. The terrain scale. So by default, the size of this terrain, we don't really know how large is it in real life. Okay. But the value, you can know by looking at this value here, terrain side length, and it says 1 kilometer. Okay, that means that seen from above, on each side of this of the terrain is a kilometer long, which is not very large, but already a nice start. Okay. And this is different from the scale. The scale is 0.01. The scale you set here is the default scale that the terrain will have each time you generate it. So 0.01 is the scale of the object in Blender, but in real life, it's supposed to be a kilometer long on each side. So by default, 1 Blender unit equals 1 meter. Okay, this is what SceneTerrain assumes, and since we scaled it down 100 times, now that means a Blender unit equals 100 meters, and this can be verified by going into Top View. Oh, sorry, this is my. I'm going out of memory a bit. Top View and orthographic, and if we count the number of Blender units on each side, it should be 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, 100 kilometers. 1 kilometer and 1 Blender unit equals 100 meters. In this case, which is the default case, right? So that's how you know the real world scale related to the Blender unit system. And here we have the resolution, but let's first see the random seed. If I keep the random seed at 0, I have a different terrain every time I click on this button. But if I set the seed to something other than 0, let's say 1 or 2, whatever, I will have the same shape every time I generate a terrain. And this can be useful if you find a terrain shape that you like. You can regenerate it later, or you can regenerate it on another computer, or you can also change the generation values while keeping the same shape, which can be useful, as we're going to see right now. So now that we have, I don't know, any shape for the demonstration purpose will do, like this one, you can better understand what the other values do, especially those two. So the resolution is the resolution of the grid. What is the grid? The terrain is made of a grid. Seen from the top, that's just a simple boring grid. But since we are in 3D, the points have been moved vertically and they form the mountains and the depths of the lakes, etc. Right? But if this grid was more dense, we could see more detail. We could see more little cracks and little features on the terrain. And this can be controlled with this value. So if I leave the seed on 4, not 0, but anything other than 0, and for instance I double the resolution and I generate the terrain again, my grid will be twice more dense. Okay, and this gives me more detail. Great. However, the flat shading here is making it obvious that we are looking at a mesh or a very coarse grid. So by default, it's not smooth shaded. You can click on this checkbox, and the next time you generate the terrain, the shading will be smooth. Or you can simply enter into edit mode and select and shade everything smooth. Now that looks a bit better. Okay. One quick note on the resolution. You don't need to go very high. I would suggest not going above 2000, because the higher the resolution, the more detail we have. That's cool, but also the longer it takes for SceneTerrain to generate the mesh, and also the more memory it will take, and the larger the file will be when you save the blend file. So don't go too crazy on this value. Of course, you can set any value you like. That depends on your needs. You can experiment, but for as far as my experience goes, I would say 256 and 512 are quite enough in most cases, unless you're making very large terrains, and this is controlled with this parameter here. As you probably noticed, every time we generate a terrain, we need to wait a bit of time for SceneTerrain to generate the mesh. Okay, but when we are waiting, we don't see anything, no update, no progress bar or nothing. We just stare at a frozen Blender. We can't even interact with Blender. Blender is just frozen. That's the way, that's a limitation of Blender. I tried to go around it. Perhaps there are ways, but I haven't found one for now. So before you generate a terrain which is large, or I mean, especially the resolution, if you increase the resolution to something starting at 512 or above, you should not forget to open the Blender console, okay? Because when you are generating the terrain, SceneTerrain will output a lot of useful messages and logs and other stuff, textual stuff to this console, and that's the only way to know what's going on under the hood when the generation process is in progress. Okay, so don't forget to open it before you generate the terrain, because when it's started, you can't do anything in Blender, even open this console. So you'll have to close it, and you'll lose your work if you want to interrupt the generation process. Okay, so now let's see how we can have bigger terrains. So the resolution, I put it back to 256 or even 128, so it will be faster for this demonstration. And we have this terrain. What if I want a bigger terrain? If I want a bigger terrain in real life, scaling it like this is not what I want. This is scaling the Blender object relatively to the in the Blender unit system. That's not what I want. What I want is this value here. Right now it's 1 square kilometer. Let's make it 4 square kilometers by doubling the side length. And if I keep the seed if I don't change the seed, which is 4 right now, we'll have the same shape with added land around this initial shape. So let's see what we have. I think it should be this direction. Yeah, let's see. Let's remember that we have this coast here. We have this coast here. All right, so that's the same coast as you can see here. So before, our terrain was cut about here, and now we have all these land added, and we have a larger landscape, which is cool because now we have a bigger area to play with. However, you should notice that though we have a larger terrain, the resolution is quite low. This is because we doubled the area that the grid covers, but the grid still has the same density overall, not per spatial unit. Spatial, how do you say spatial? In space. So, for example, if this mountain here was I'm just making up numbers here. If it had 100 points to describe its form, now it only has 50 points. So it has a lower resolution than before. So my advice is to modify these two values together, always. Unless, of course, you want a lower resolution if you increase the side length. So since I doubled the side length, I should double the terrain resolution as well. And now my terrain looks better. Okay. So these are the general terrain options. In the tabs below, The first tab, the preset shape tab, is the one that we want. It allows you to change a few things. For instance, the size of the features, like the lakes and the mountains, the amount of jagginess. I'm not sure if we can say jagginess, but we'll see what that means. You can control the amount of water, the depth of the water bodies, the water level, and the amount of mountains and the height of the mountains. Let's see them one by one very quickly. We'll have a lower resolution and a smaller terrain, so we can generate the terrains more quickly. Okay. So the size of features means the lakes and the mountains will be smaller or larger. For instance, actually I want a 4 square kilometers terrain. Let's make the features smaller. And now we should have this kind of stuff. So that means that for the same area of our terrain, we have more things going on. Actually, we have more mountains and more lakes and rivers. If we double it, if we double the standard value, now we have the initial mountain is covering a lot more area. Okay, jagged amount, that is the amount of how should I say, the amount of let's say detail. It's better explained with an example. So if I say 1, that means I have this strange shape. 2, we have a more refined shape. 3, we have an even more refined shape, and we can start to see the mountains being formed. 4 times, jagged amount value 4. 5, 6. So as you can see, the higher this value, the more refined the shape of the terrain is. And this is linked to the resolution, because above a certain amount, for instance 15, there is not enough, in this example, there is not enough resolution to see even more refinement of our terrain, because the refinement goes subgrid. Okay, the grid cannot catch the small details that our terrain really has. But if you increase the resolution enough, you can go again, higher again, and keep increasing, and you will see more detail. So if you increase the resolution but the terrain still looks smooth, too smooth for your taste, increase this value. Okay. But the default of 15 should be enough for most cases. Amount of water, this one is self-explanatory. If I set it to 0, I have no water. If I set it to 50, I have more water. And if I have 100%, if I put it to 100%, I have the maximum amount of water possible. All right, depth of water bodies. This controls if I look at the terrain on the side, as you can see here, this is underwater, this part. If you want it to have the same shape but to go deeper, you control it with this value. So depth 100, if I set it to 200 and generate a terrain again, as you can see now it goes twice as deep. Water level, right now the default value is -3 meters, and that's at the this is the beach. If we can say it's if we right now it doesn't have the color of a beach, but where the land, I mean the water meets the land, you can set it to be, if you set it to 0, this will be right at the limit of the flat land. And if you set it to -10 meters, then the water is 10 meters below the flat land. Okay. This can be used for simulating the tide, for instance, or if you want more prominent beaches. And finally, we have the mountains. Just like the water, you can control the amount of mountains in percentage. So 0 means I don't want any mountain, I just want flat land. 50% means about half of the flat land is covered with mountains, and 100% means all the flat land is covered with mountains. And right now, if you set the amount of water to 100% and the amount of mountains to 100%, you have no flat land left. And therefore, there is no room for a city. If you want to put a city on the terrain, you need to at least have one of those two values below 100%. Because the city cannot be constructed, of course, underwater, but it cannot be constructed on the mountains. It really needs perfectly flat land, like here, for instance, like here. Okay. And the height of the mountains, this is simple to understand. If I double it, then we have the same mountains but higher. You can go as much or as low as you like, but just be careful not to have unrealistic values. If you're going for realistic scenes, just keep those values under control. And you can reset the values to their defaults with this button. Alright, there is another option for changing the shape of the terrain, which is they are located in the custom shape tab, but I will leave it for advanced users and possibly for a later tutorial. The only thing I forgot to say for the shape of the terrain, I guess, is this option here. You can change the overall look of your mountains. You have for now you have the eroded mountains by default, but you also have the eroded craters like this. Okay, this is like craters, and you have the mountain chains like this one. All right. So that's it for the terrain shape.